Hearthstone Animal Refuge looked peaceful beneath the snow, but something had already crossed its back fence. Inside the yard, a German Shepherd puppy hurried through the snow, dragging a pouch of food. When a volunteer reached down to stop him, the mother stepped between them, letting the puppy escape. Beyond the fence, an elderly veteran stood with trembling hands, making everyone suspect he had stolen the food. But a former Navy SEAL realized that some hidden secret lay behind it all. Then a weak bark came from beyond the pines, from a building everyone believed was empty. Where are you watching from today? Stay with us until the end. Share your thoughts, and please like and subscribe as we work toward our first 1,000 subscribers. The food bag was halfway across the rescue yard when Jonah Hale saw the puppy dragging it toward the back fence. Finn, an 8-week-old German Shepherd, had caught the soft plastic corner between his small teeth. His oversized front paws slipped each time the bag crossed a patch of packed snow. But the puppy kept pulling. 10 pounds of softened dog food was far beyond what Finn could truly carry, so most of the bag remained on the ground, leaving a shallow trail behind him. Snow fell through the pale December morning, gathering on the roofs and fence rails of Hearthstone Animal Refuge in Frostwood Valley. The small shelter occupied a group of renovated farm buildings near a line of northern woods. Jonah had worked there for nearly 2 years, repairing stalls, unloading feed, clearing frozen drains, and sitting patiently with animals that would not yet allow anyone else close. At 49, the former Navy SEAL still had the broad shoulders and controlled movements of a man shaped by military discipline. His dark brown hair was cut short, silver at the temples, and a close salt and pepper beard covered his square jaw. Yet the quality people noticed most was not his strength. It was the pause he allowed before deciding what something meant. Years earlier, an incomplete report had nearly turned a routine military operation into an irreversible mistake. Jonah had carried that lesson into civilian life. He had learned that fear often arrived before evidence, and once fear found a story it liked, people rarely stopped to ask whether the story was true. That morning, his immediate task was simpler. He was helping move the weekly food delivery into the storage barn before the snow deepened. Then Finn stole a bag. "Hey, little man." The voice belonged to Mason Reed, a 19-year-old volunteer standing near the loading cart. Mason set down the smaller sack he had been carrying and walked toward the puppy. Finn pulled harder. The bag caught against a frozen ridge and stopped. The puppy shook his head, backed up 2 steps, then tried again. Mason smiled at first. "You're not getting far with that." He reached down for the bag. Greta moved before his fingers touched it. The 6-year-old German Shepherd stepped between Mason and Finn, placing her body across the young man's path. She was black and honey gold, with a dark saddle across her back, a small notch along the outer edge of her right ear, and a pale golden mark above her left eye. She did not bark. She did not bare her teeth. She simply stood still. Her shoulders tightened beneath her winter coat. Her amber-brown eyes followed Mason's hand. Mason stopped. Jonah was already crossing the yard, but he did not hurry. A rushed approach could turn uncertainty into panic, especially with a protective mother and a young puppy caught between several people. "Let your hand fall," Jonah said. Mason lowered it. Greta's gaze followed the movement all the way to his side. When Mason stepped back, the tension in her shoulders eased. She turned, touched Finn once behind the ear with her nose, and nudged him toward the fence. Finn seized the bag again. The puppy was not guarding food. Greta was not trying to keep it for herself. Both dogs seemed concerned only with moving it somewhere else. Jonah looked toward the rear fence. A man stood on the other side. Earl Whitaker was 78, thin beneath an old olive military coat that had faded almost gray across the shoulders. A knitted cap covered most of his white hair. One hand gripped a wooden cane, while the other trembled openly near the front of his coat. Earl lived alone on the road beyond the former Dorsey property. He had been a close friend of Samuel Dorsey, the retired serviceman who had owned Greta and Finn before his death. Since the two dogs arrived at Hearthstone, Earl had appeared several times near the back boundary, usually staying only a few minutes. No one had understood why. That morning, the timing looked bad. Mason looked from the food bag to Earl. "Is that where it's been going?" Two more workers had stopped beside the loading barn. Nora Bell, the 62-year-old manager of Hearthstone, stepped out of the office with her radio still in one hand. Snow caught in her short, silver-blonde hair before she pulled up the collar of her brown quilted vest. Earl heard Mason's question. His face hardened. Nora moved closer to the fence, but remained inside the rescue property. She asked Earl whether he had been taking food from the shelter or encouraging the dogs to bring it to him. The question was calm. The accusation beneath it was not. Earl's hand tightened around the cane. "You people see an old coat and shaking hands, and you think you've solved something," he said. His voice came out louder than the open yard required. Finn dropped the bag and looked up. Greta turned one ear toward Earl but did not leave the puppy. Nora tried to explain that food had been missing for several days. Earl cut her off. "You don't know what you're talking about." He turned too quickly, planted the cane in the snow, and started away along the outer fence. His right foot dragged slightly before finding solid ground. He did not look back at Greta. He did not call Finn. He did not reach for the bag. Still, the anger remained after he was gone. It settled over the yard more quickly than the snow. By mid-morning, the food delivery had been moved inside, but work around Hearthstone had lost its usual rhythm. People lowered their voices whenever Jonah passed. 3 missing food portions became 5 in the retelling. Earl's visits became something he had supposedly been doing every night. The story was growing faster than the facts. Nora gathered the staff and volunteers inside the feed room shortly before noon. The room smelled of dry grain, wet coats, and the coffee Jonah had forgotten on a shelf beside the door. Finn rested in a crate near the wall with a chew toy between his paws. Greta lay outside the crate, her body positioned so the puppy remained within reach. Nora stood beside a clipboard and reviewed what they actually knew. Small amounts of food had disappeared. Finn had been seen moving a bag toward the back fence. Greta had blocked Mason from taking it. Had been standing outside the property. The concerns were legitimate. The conclusions were not yet settled. One employee recommended sealing every gap beneath the fence before the end of the day. Another suggested feeding Greta and Finn separately in case the mother was encouraging possession around food. Mason, still embarrassed by how quickly Greta had stopped him, asked whether the incident should be entered into her record as resource guarding. Someone else said Earl should be formally warned not to return. Jonah listened until the room went quiet. He did not defend Earl. The man's temper had not helped him, and the missing food could not simply be ignored. Greta and Finn were under Hearthstone's care. If they escaped, crossed a road, or became lost in worsening weather, kindness would not excuse the consequences. But Jonah kept seeing the same moment. Earl walking away. Greta remaining beside Finn. Jonah looked at Nora. If Greta was protecting food for Earl, why didn't she follow him when he left? No one answered immediately. Nora lowered her clipboard. Jonah continued in the same even tone. Greta had watched the fence after Earl disappeared, not the direction Earl had taken. Finn had been dragging the food toward a specific point beneath the boards. The dogs might have been connected to Earl, but that did not mean Earl was the destination. Mason glanced toward Greta. The German Shepherd had raised her head. Her ears were directed toward the rear of the property. For a few seconds, the room held only the sound of Finn working his teeth against the rubber toy. Nora agreed that Jonah could inspect the fence before they changed Greta's behavioral record. However, the opening still had to be closed by the following evening. Snow was expected to continue, and Hearthstone could not knowingly leave an escape route open. That gave Jonah less than a day. After the meeting, he put on his waxed canvas coat and crossed the rear yard alone. The falling snow had softened the tracks near the kennels, but the area along the fence was protected by a line of leaning pines. The gap was easy to find. Frozen ground had lifted one section beneath the lowest board, creating a space wide enough for Greta to flatten herself and crawl through. Finn could pass without lowering his back. Jonah crouched. There were paw prints on both sides. Greta's were clear and deep. Finn's smaller tracks wandered over them. Between the prints ran a narrow groove where a light object had been dragged repeatedly across the frozen soil. There were no fresh human footprints leading close to the opening. Earl had stood nearly 20 feet away that morning. Jonah followed the groove along the inner fence and found a blue-gray plastic bowl partly buried beneath the snow. The edge was worn from being pulled across rough ground. Several honey-colored hairs clung to one side, likely from Greta or Finn. But along the opposite rim were 3 coarse silver hairs. Jonah removed one glove and held the bowl near enough to examine it. The scent was faint beneath snow and old food, but it did not belong to either dog inside the yard. It carried the heavier, musky odor of an older animal, a dog Jonah had never met. Behind him, Greta approached the fence. Nora had allowed the dog into the yard under supervision, and Mason stood far back near the gate, holding the end of a long line. Greta came to the opening but did not try to pass through. She lowered her nose to the empty space, breathed in, then looked beyond Jonah toward the old Dorsey land. The land sloped gently through a stand of pines. Beyond the trees stood a weathered storage building that had once served the farm. Snow blurred its roofline, but Jonah could still make out one dark window and a narrow door. The old warehouse was supposed to be empty. For most of the morning, the wind had moved steadily across the valley. Now it stopped. The silence was so sudden that Jonah could hear snow slipping from a pine branch. Then a bark came from beyond the trees. It was deep, but not strong. One bark, followed by a pause. Then another, shorter and uneven at the end. Greta's entire posture changed. Both ears turned toward the sound, her tail lowered. She stepped closer to the gap and stood completely still, listening. Finn began whining from inside the building behind them. Jonah looked again at the silver hairs on the bowl. People at Hearthstone had seen an angry old man, a protective mother, and a puppy dragging food. Every part of that picture had been real. Yet real details could still form a false story when they were placed together too quickly. Jonah brushed the snow from the bowl and stood. He told Nora he would inspect the old building before the gap was sealed the next evening. He did not yet know whether Earl had lied, whether a dog had been left behind, or whether the weak bark came from an animal that had simply wandered onto the property. He knew only that something living was on the other side of the fence, and Greta had known it before any of them. By the following afternoon, the weak bark from beyond the pines had become the one sound Jonah Hale could not dismiss. He had told Nora Bell that he would inspect the old storage building before the gap beneath Hearthstone's rear fence was sealed. Nora had agreed, but only under clear limits. Greta and Finn were still under the rescue's care. Jonah was not to release them deliberately, and he was to report any movement beyond the property as soon as it happened. So Jonah waited during the dogs' supervised afternoon exercise. Snow had stopped before dawn, leaving Frostwood Valley under a hard white brightness. Sunlight reflected from the yard strongly enough to make the metal latches shine. Along the back fence, however, the leaning pines cast a narrow strip of shade, where the snow remained thin and uneven. Jonah stood near that shaded section, with a long lead looped over one shoulder. A flashlight, compact first aid pouch, and folding fence tool rested on his work belt. He carried enough equipment to recover 2 wandering dogs, but nothing that would frighten them into running farther. Greta noticed him watching. The adult German shepherd crossed the yard without hurry. Her amber-brown eyes moved from Jonah to the lowest fence board, then back again. Finn followed several steps behind, distracted first by a crust of snow and then by the smell of the feed room door. For 10 quiet minutes, nothing happened. Then a worker carried a box of individually wrapped soft food portions past the exercise yard. One small package slipped free and landed beside the gate. Finn saw it before anyone else. The puppy bounded forward, caught the corner in his teeth, and turned toward the rear fence. Jonah did not call him back. He raised his radio instead and told Nora that Greta and Finn were moving toward the known opening. He added that he was following on foot and would remain within sight. Nora answered that the rear service gate would stay unlocked. Her voice was controlled, but Jonah could hear the concern beneath it. Finn reached the fence and dropped the food package. He pushed his nose under the lowest board, snorted snow from his nostrils, and pawed once at the frozen edge. Greta stepped beside him. Using the bridge of her muzzle, she swept away a thin layer of loose snow. Then she lowered her shoulders, flattened her body, and slid through the narrow space. Finn stared after her. The puppy attempted the same movement too quickly and bumped one oversized ear against the board. He backed up, shook himself, and tried again with less confidence. His smaller body passed easily once he stopped fighting the opening. Jonah crossed through the service gate rather than crawling beneath the fence. By the time he reached the outer side, Greta had already returned to Finn. The food package lay in the snow between them. Greta took it gently in her mouth, carried it several yards, then set it down. Finn hurried after her, reclaimed it, and continued. That small exchange told Jonah more than the missing food records had. Greta was not sending the puppy ahead. She was teaching him a route. The path curved beside the pines, protected from the deepest drifting snow. It was no wider than the space made by Greta's repeated steps. Her prints overlapped one another, packed down over several days. Finn's smaller tracks wandered in and out of them. The old storage building stood roughly 150 yards from the fence. It belonged to the remaining Dorsey estate, separated from the rescue by a strip of frozen field and the pine windbreak. The distance was short for Greta. For Finn, it required effort. The puppy dropped the food package twice in the first 50 yards. Each time, Greta stopped. Once, she returned and lifted the package far enough to place it on firmer snow. The second time, she simply waited beside Finn until he found a better grip. She never moved so far ahead that the puppy lost sight of her. Jonah stayed behind them without closing the distance. Greta knew he was there. Her right ear turned toward his footsteps whenever his boots broke through the crusted snow. Halfway to the building, Finn stumbled into a shallow depression hidden beneath the white surface. The package slipped from his mouth and slid under a low pine branch. Greta retrieved it, but did not give it back immediately. She stood with the food between her teeth and looked toward Jonah. For several seconds, neither moved. Jonah had spent years learning the difference between an animal challenging a person and an animal measuring one. Greta's body remained loose. Her tail was low. She was not warning him away. She was deciding whether his presence changed the journey. Jonah turned one shoulder aside and lowered his empty hand. He did not call her. He did not step closer. Greta held his gaze, then placed the package in front of Finn. The puppy seized it and continued. Whatever waited in the old building, Greta had decided Jonah could come near enough to see it. The storage building had once served as a farm workshop. Its gray boards leaned slightly with age, but the roof remained sound. A metal vent near one wall released a faint thread of warm air. Snow had been cleared from the narrow doorway, though the path leading to it was uneven and marked by the round impressions of a cane. Greta stopped at the threshold. Finn arrived beside her, breathing hard through his nose. The food package hung from his mouth, damp and wrinkled but still sealed. Jonah expected Greta to block the door. Instead, she turned her head toward him and sat. She did not wag her tail. She offered no invitation that a human could easily mistake for friendliness. She simply remained beside the entrance, without placing herself in his path. Jonah knocked twice against the wooden frame. Something moved inside. A metal object scraped the floor, followed by a man's strained breath. The door stood partly open. Jonah pushed it only far enough to look through. The outer section of the building held old tools, a rusted wheelbarrow, and several empty feed sacks. Beyond it, a smaller room had been enclosed with insulated panels. A wall heater glowed behind a protective guard. Dry bedding covered a raised wooden platform, and an electric bowl held water that had not frozen. Earl Whitaker sat on a low stool beside an elderly German shepherd. The dog was large, despite the weight age had taken from him. His back carried a faded black saddle threaded with gray. Both rear legs rested stiffly beneath his body, and his muzzle had turned almost completely silver. A round brass tag hung from his reddish-brown collar. Roscoe. The name was engraved deeply enough for Jonah to read from the doorway. Earl held a can of dog food between his knees. His left hand tried to steady it, while his right worked an old manual opener around the rim. The opener slipped. The half-cut lid shifted sideways, and a spoonful of food fell onto the rubber mat. Earl stared at it. His shoulders dropped more than the mistake required. That was when Jonah understood the part no one at Hearthstone had seen. Roscoe was not living in filth. The old dog had clean bedding, working heat, fresh water, and a coat that had been brushed recently. Earl had not abandoned him, but care that had once been manageable was becoming heavier than Earl could admit. A full sack of senior dog food rested just inside the outer doorway. Snow had melted beneath one end, showing that someone had dragged it that far and stopped. It remained several yards from the feeding area. Earl could reach Roscoe. He could no longer easily bring everything Roscoe needed with him. Finn stepped around Greta and carried the soft food package inside. The puppy placed it near Roscoe's front paws, then backed away, as if waiting to see whether he had completed the task correctly. Roscoe lifted his head. His eyes were amber but clouded slightly with age. He smelled the package, then turned toward Greta. Greta crossed the room and examined him carefully. She smelled around his muzzle, both ears, and the side of his neck. After that quiet inspection, she lowered herself beside him. Roscoe shifted one front paw across the bedding and slowly placed his head on Greta's leg. No one had trained that moment for an audience. There was no excitement in it. No dramatic reunion. Only the deep ease of two animals returning to a familiar position. Earl finally noticed Jonah in the doorway. The softness left his face at once. "You need to get out." Earl's voice was sharper than it had been at the fence. He pushed himself upright, but the movement made the can slide from between his knees. Jonah stepped forward only far enough to stop it from rolling beneath the heater. Earl gripped his cane. "I said leave." Jonah set the can upright on the work table. He did not touch the food or attempt to take the opener from Earl. "Roscoe belongs to Samuel Dorsey's estate," Earl said. "He does not belong to your shelter." Jonah heard the fear beneath the claim. Earl was not merely protecting a dog. He was defending the last piece of authority he believed he still possessed. "I'm not here to take him," Jonah said. Earl gave a bitter laugh. "That is what people say before they begin explaining what an old man can no longer be trusted to do." Jonah let the words settle. He checked what he could without handling Roscoe. The heater appeared stable and safely guarded. The bedding was dry. The water bowl worked. Roscoe tracked movement with his eyes and raised his head when Jonah shifted position. His breathing was calm. There was no immediate emergency. There was also no reason to pretend everything was fine. Jonah nodded toward the bag near the entrance. "Can you move that by yourself?" Earl looked at the sack, but did not answer. Jonah did not repeat the question. He inspected the door seal, the clear path to the water bowl. and the way Roscoe held his rear legs. The old dog had enough strength to adjust his position, but not enough to rise quickly. "When did a veterinarian last examine him?" Jonah asked. Earl's jaw tightened. Outside, snow loosened from the roof and fell with a soft rush beside the wall. Finn startled and pressed against Greta. Greta remained still, allowing the puppy to settle against her ribs. Earl looked down at the three dogs. He had an answer. Jonah could see that much. Shame simply stood between the answer and his voice. Jonah understood shame well enough not to force it into the open before it was ready. But understanding did not erase responsibility. Roscoe needed more than warmth and loyalty. He needed an honest assessment of what age was taking from him and from the man trying to care for him. Jonah moved back toward the doorway. "I'll tell Nora he has heat, water, clean bedding, and someone checking him," he said. "I'll also tell her he needs a veterinary visit." Earl's hand tightened around the cane. Jonah expected another order to leave. Instead, Earl reached slowly into the inside pocket of his faded military coat. He removed a watch. It was an old military field watch with a steel face and a worn black nylon strap. The glass carried several fine scratches. Earl held it in his open palm, though the tremor in his fingers made the watch move against his skin. "Samuel gave me this," Earl said. Greta raised her head at Samuel's name. Earl looked at Roscoe, not Jonah. "He gave me the watch and the key to this building on the last night we spoke." The anger in Earl's voice had not disappeared. It had changed shape. Beneath it now was something older and more difficult to defend against. A promise. Jonah remained by the door. Earl closed his fingers around the watch. "If you want to understand why that dog is here and why Greta keeps coming back, then you need to hear what Samuel asked me to do before he died." Earl Whitaker kept the military watch closed inside his fist, as if the small piece of steel could still hold back everything that had changed. Jonah Hale remained near the doorway of the heated room. Outside, the winter light was already thinning behind the pines. Inside, Greta lay beside Roscoe, while Finn worked at the sealed food package he had carried through the snow. Earl had told Jonah that Samuel Dorsey gave him the watch and the key to the building on the last night they spoke. Now the old man lowered himself back onto the stool, breathing carefully until the strain left his face. "Samuel knew he was running out of time," Earl said. His voice had lost some of its anger. It still carried resistance, but the resistance no longer seemed directed only at Jonah. Earl sounded like a man arguing with a memory that had refused to become easier. Samuel had spent his final weeks trying to arrange what would happen to his three dogs. Greta had recently given birth to Finn, and the puppy still depended on her for comfort, correction, and much of his sense of safety. Finn also needed his vaccinations, regular weighing, and a cleaner environment than Samuel's declining health allowed him to maintain. For that reason, Samuel had signed temporary intake papers with Hearthstone Animal Refuge. Greta would go with Finn. Separating them then would have served no one. Roscoe had been different. The 13-year-old German Shepherd had lived on the Dorsey property for most of his life. His eyesight had faded. His rear legs had stiffened. More important, he had never adjusted well to unfamiliar rooms. Earl explained that 1 year earlier, Roscoe had spent a night at a veterinary clinic after a routine procedure. The old dog had paced until his legs shook, refused food, and pressed himself against the kennel door whenever footsteps passed. Samuel never forgot it. He said moving Roscoe all at once might finish what age had started, Earl told Jonah. Not because the dog was dying, because he would think everything familiar had disappeared. Samuel's estate was managed by Clara Mercer, a local attorney known for handling farm properties and end-of-life arrangements, without turning every family decision into a courtroom matter. Clara held a copy of the temporary care agreement. The document allowed Earl to keep Roscoe in the heated storage room, make decisions about daily feeding and ordinary care, and use the building until Samuel's granddaughter could be located. Earl could not sell Roscoe, give him away, or move him permanently without authorization. The granddaughter's name was Megan Dorsey. Samuel had given Clara an address and an old telephone number. Neither had produced an answer before his death. At first, Earl's part of the arrangement had worked. Each morning, he walked from his small house along the edge of the Dorsey land. He brought medication hidden in cheese, checked the water heater, changed the bedding, and brushed the loose fur from Roscoe's back. In the evening, he returned with food and sat until the old dog slept. Earl said those visits took 10 minutes each way when the ground was dry. Then winter arrived early. Ice formed along the rutted lane. Snow covered the flat stones Earl used for balance. The wooden cart he once pulled behind him began catching in the drifts. On some mornings, the walk required nearly an hour. The tremor in Earl's hands worsened with cold and fatigue. He could still measure Roscoe's food if someone opened the container. He could still read the medication labels. He could still tell by one glance whether Roscoe had slept well. What he could no longer do easily was move the full bags, turn the manual opener, and cross frozen ground twice every day without risk. Jonah looked toward the unopened sack near the outer doorway. Everything Earl described had already left evidence in the room. The care was real. So was the decline. Greta had noticed both before any person at Hearthstone did. From the rescue yard, she could sometimes see Earl moving along the far side of the trees. She could smell Roscoe when the wind passed through the fence. Once Greta found the opening beneath the lowest board, she returned to the old route that had once connected Samuel's dogs. At first, she carried only scraps left after feeding. Later, she began moving small packages from the supply area whenever someone failed to latch a bin completely. Finn watched her. The puppy began carrying whatever his small mouth could manage. Earl admitted he had seen them arrive. The first time Greta appeared at the building, Roscoe had struggled to his feet before she reached the door. She had smelled his muzzle, circled the bedding, and lain beside him exactly as she had that afternoon. Earl could have reported the gap in the fence. He could have called Nora. Instead, he watched Finn drag a portion of food across the floor and told himself the arrangement was temporary. It was not theirs to carry, Earl said. I knew that. He opened his hand and looked at the military watch. The second hand continued moving, steady despite the scratches across the glass. But every time that pup came through the door, Roscoe ate. And every time Roscoe ate, I had one more reason to believe I was still doing what Samuel asked. The confession did not make Earl sound relieved. It made him sound ashamed. Jonah understood why the old man had shouted at the fence. Anger had been easier than admitting that an 8-week-old puppy had begun completing the parts of a promise Earl's hands could no longer manage. Earl had already buried his wife. Then he had lost Samuel, the friend who continued visiting long after other people stopped knowing what to say. Roscoe was not simply another responsibility. The old dog still waited for the rhythm of Earl's cane. He still lifted his head when Earl spoke. Every evening that Earl opened the building, someone inside behaved as though his arrival mattered. Losing the right to care for Roscoe would not feel like losing a task. It would feel like proof that the world no longer needed Earl to arrive. The room became quiet, except for the heater. Finn finally stopped pawing at the sealed package and settled beside Greta's tail. Roscoe breathed slowly against her front leg. Earl reached into the inside pocket of his coat again. This time, he removed a narrow wooden case, darkened at the corners by years of handling. The case had once held the watch. Now it held a folded letter. Earl unfolded the paper with both hands. The tremor made the edges flutter, so he laid it on the table and smoothed it with his palm. Samuel's handwriting was uneven, but readable. The letter thanked Earl for staying during the worst seasons of Samuel's life. It mentioned the years after Samuel's wife died, the months when Roscoe first began losing strength, and the quiet mornings when two old soldiers had sat together without needing to turn memory into conversation. Samuel wrote that he trusted Earl to remain beside Roscoe until Megan could return. Then the letter changed. Samuel had known his friend well enough to anticipate the danger inside that loyalty. Jonah read the central lines twice. Loyalty is not carrying every burden alone. Loyalty is making sure the weakest among us is still treated with dignity, even when that means opening the door and letting someone else help. Below those words, Samuel had added one final sentence. Do not confuse being needed with being the only one allowed to care. Earl turned his face toward the heater. I remembered the part about staying, he said. I made myself forget the part about opening the door. That admission changed the room more than any accusation could have. Until then, Earl had spoken, as though Samuel's promise gave him only one command: endure. The letter showed something else. Samuel had not asked Earl to destroy himself, proving his loyalty. He had asked him to protect Roscoe's dignity, and he had understood that one aging man might eventually need help doing it. Faith was sometimes spoken of as the strength to carry a burden. Jonah had lived long enough to know it could also be the humility to admit the burden had become too heavy for one set of hands. Roscoe stirred. The old dog lifted his head from Greta's leg and tried to stand. His front paws found the mat, but his rear legs slid apart on the smooth edge beyond the bedding. Earl pushed up from the stool. Before he could reach Roscoe, Greta rose. She stepped beside the old dog and pressed her left shoulder along his ribs. Roscoe leaned against her, gathered his rear feet beneath him, and stood. Greta remained there until his balance settled. The movement lasted only seconds. No one had commanded it. Greta had not solved Roscoe's age or removed his weakness. She had simply given him enough support to complete what he was still able to do. Earl watched the two dogs. The lesson was too close to the words on the table to ignore. Jonah folded the letter along its old crease and returned it to the case. Then he told Earl what would happen next. Roscoe needed a veterinary examination. The old dog's stiffness might be ordinary aging, but guessing would not protect him. Hearthstone also had to know Greta and Finn had been leaving the property. The fence opening created a real risk, especially for a puppy in winter. Earl's expression closed. You said you weren't here to take him. I'm not, Jonah replied, but I won't lie about what I saw. The distinction did not comfort Earl. To him, telling Nora meant surrendering control. Once the shelter knew his hands were failing, and Roscoe had missed a recent veterinary check, Earl believed every decision would move away from him. You came in here, read a dead man's private words, and now you're going back to build a case against me. Jonah did not defend himself with a speech. He understood that honesty could feel like betrayal when fear had already decided what honesty would cost. I'll tell them Roscoe is warm, clean, alert, and cared for, Jonah said. I'll also tell them you need help with the parts you can't safely do anymore. Earl looked at the watch. That sounds like betrayal with better manners. Jonah accepted the sentence without answering. He clipped the long lead to Greta's collar and lifted Finn inside his coat for the return walk. The puppy had already crossed the snow once and was beginning to shiver from tiredness. At the door, Jonah looked back. Roscoe had lowered himself beside Earl's boots. The old man held the wooden watch case against one knee. Neither of them looked ready to be separated. That did not mean silence would keep them together. By the time Jonah reached Hearthstone, the light had faded to blue across the yard. A wide board had been fastened over the opening beneath the rear fence. One of the afternoon workers had found Greta and Finn missing and closed the gap before learning where Jonah had gone. Finn twisted in Jonah's coat as soon as he saw it. When Jonah set the puppy down inside the yard, Finn ran to the board and began scraping snow from its lower edge. His small paws moved quickly, but the wood did not shift. Greta stood several feet behind him. She did not dig. She stared through the fence toward the dark line of pines and the building beyond them. The new board solved one problem. Greta and Finn could no longer leave the rescue yard. It also broke the only path connecting Roscoe to the two dogs that still remembered him as family. Nora met Jonah near the service gate. She had already spoken with Clara Mercer. The estate attorney would attend a meeting at Hearthstone the following morning to confirm who had authority over Roscoe, the building, and the temporary care arrangement. Nora asked Jonah to present everything he had seen. Jonah looked at Finn, clawing at the snow, and Greta watching the trees. Earl believed Jonah had chosen the rescue over him. The truth was more difficult. Jonah had chosen to bring the whole problem into the light, knowing light did not always feel merciful when it first entered a closed room. The key to Samuel Dorsey's storage building rested inside Earl Whitaker's coat pocket when he entered the break room at Hearthstone Animal Refuge. He kept one hand over it, as though someone might reach through the faded olive fabric and take it before the meeting began. The room had been built for 6 tired workers, not for deciding the future of an old man and an aging dog. A square table occupied most of the floor. Wet boots crowded the heater vent. Through the single window, morning snow covered the rear fence and the board that now sealed Greta's familiar path to Roscoe. Nora Bell stood near the coffee machine with a red-brown folder held against her chest. As Hearthstone's manager, she carried responsibility for every animal, volunteer, damaged gate, unpaid bill, and insurance form on the property. Her concern was not imaginary. Neither was Earl's fear. Jonah Hale sat at the end of the table with Finn beneath his chair. The puppy had been given a rubber ring, though he abandoned it whenever a voice rose. Greta lay beside Jonah, her body turned toward Earl. Across from Nora sat Clara Mercer, the attorney managing Samuel's estate. Clara was 57, with ash-brown hair cut neatly at her jaw and thin reading glasses resting low on her nose. A dark, wine-colored document case stood open beside her. Clara did not begin with accusations. She arranged 3 documents in a straight line and explained what each one meant. The first confirmed that the storage building and the surrounding strip of land still belonged to Samuel's unsettled estate. Hearthstone had no ownership claim over it. The second was the temporary care agreement Samuel had signed before his death. It gave Earl permission to use the building and make ordinary daily decisions for Roscoe. Earl could choose the dog's feeding times, maintain his bedding, administer prescribed medication, and decide who entered the room. The agreement did not give Earl the right to sell Roscoe, surrender him, or move him permanently. Those larger decisions would belong first to Megan Dorsey, Samuel's granddaughter, if Clara could locate her and if Megan accepted responsibility. The third document covered Greta and Finn. Samuel had legally placed both dogs with Hearthstone for temporary care, medical supervision, and eventual adoption if Megan declined to take them. Nora listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, Nora stated the limit of her own authority. She could not walk onto the estate and remove Roscoe simply because she disagreed with Earl's care. If a veterinarian found an immediate welfare concern, Clara could authorize transport for examination or temporary safety. But Nora could, and would, prevent Greta and Finn from leaving Hearthstone without supervision. "Finn is 8 weeks old," Nora said. "He crossed open ground in winter. Greta crossed with him. There is a county road beyond the east field, and neither dog was wearing a lead." Earl looked at Jonah rather than Nora. They knew where they were going. Jonah did not answer immediately. Greta had known the route. Finn had trusted Greta. Neither fact made of the journey safe. Nora continued. Small portions of food had been removed from the shelter. Greta had passed through an unsecured opening several times. Roscoe had not received a recent veterinary examination. Earl could no longer move a full food sack, and the manual opener had become difficult for him to use. Each statement was accurate. Together, they sounded to Earl like a list, proving that accuracy and kindness were enemies. A speakerphone rested in the middle of the table. Dr. Miriam Cole, a local veterinarian who had treated Samuel's dogs, had joined by telephone after Clara authorized her to review Roscoe's records. Dr. Cole explained that Roscoe's age and stiffness did not automatically require relocation. Familiar surroundings could benefit an elderly dog, especially one with a history of refusing food in unfamiliar kennels. However, the veterinarian could not recommend continuing the arrangement unchanged. Roscoe needed his mobility assessed, his medication reviewed, and his weight checked. Someone also had to be available if Earl fell, became ill, or could not reach the building. The word "someone" seemed to trouble Earl more than any medical concern. He sat rigidly, his cane angled against his knee. His right hand trembled against the curved wooden handle. Jonah watched Earl hear a message no one had actually spoken. "You are finished. You are no longer useful. Everything you have done counts for less than what you cannot do now." Earl pushed back his chair. The leg scraped sharply across the floor. Finn startled beneath Jonah's seat and pressed against his boots. "So that is it," Earl said. "You put my failures into folders, call a doctor, and decide the old man has become another problem to manage." Clara closed one document, but did not remove it from the table. Nora began to say that no final decision had been made. Earl spoke over her. "You want the building? Take it. You want the dog? Take him. You have already decided I cannot be trusted with either." He pulled the key from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. The brass struck the wood with a small, hard sound. That sound changed the meeting. Until then, they had been discussing policies, permissions, weather, medication, and risk. The key made visible what Earl believed he was losing. It was not only access to a building, it was the last responsibility Samuel had placed directly into his hand. Earl turned too quickly toward the door. His weak right foot did not clear the chair leg. The cane shifted on the linoleum, and his body tilted before he could correct himself. Greta rose. She crossed the short distance and pressed her left shoulder against Earl's leg. The German Shepherd did not pull him backward or block the door. She simply stood close enough to give him a stable surface. Earl's hand came down on her back by instinct. His fingers spread into the thick black and gold fur. The tremor remained, but his balance returned. No one spoke. Finn peered from beneath Jonah's chair, watching his mother hold still beside the old man. Greta could not read the care agreement. She did not know which person controlled the estate or what authority Nora possessed. She only recognized that Earl had lost his balance and needed a point of support. Once Earl stood securely, Greta remained beside him. The meeting had not been solved, but the language inside it had to change. Jonah leaned forward and picked up neither the key nor the documents. "We are asking the wrong question," he said. Earl kept one hand on Greta. Jonah looked first at Nora, then Clara. The question could not be whether Earl was still capable of doing every part of Roscoe's care alone. Everyone in the room already knew he was not. The better question was what assistance would allow Earl to remain responsible without placing himself or Roscoe in danger. There was a difference between taking over and standing close enough to help someone keep his footing. Samuel's letter had said as much. Clara asked Earl to sit again, but she did not reach for his arm. Greta walked beside him until he lowered himself into the chair. Then she settled near his right foot. The key remained where Earl had placed it. Nora opened her folder again. This time, the discussion began with the tasks Earl could still perform. He knew Roscoe's feeding schedule. He recognized changes in the dog's appetite and sleep. He understood which sounds caused anxiety and how long Roscoe needed before standing on cold mornings. Roscoe trusted his voice. Earl also remained mentally capable of making daily decisions. The failures were not of judgment. They were problems of weight, grip, distance, ice, and emergency backup. Those could be addressed. Dr. Cole offered to examine Roscoe inside the storage building, rather than require an immediate clinic visit. She could check his joints, heart, weight, medication, hydration, and the condition of his paws without removing him from familiar surroundings. Nora proposed dividing the food into small labeled portions at Hearthstone. Earl would still choose the amount and feeding time. Someone else would only make the containers manageable. Jonah suggested an electric can opener with a broad push switch that Earl could operate without holding the can steady. He would also inspect the wall heater, electrical outlet, insulated water bowl, and raised bedding. Clara added that the snowpath could be cleared as part of estate maintenance. A narrow strip of traction material could be laid from the lane to the building without changing Earl's legal role. The visits from Greta and Finn created a harder problem. Nora would not reopen the gap beneath the fence. Instead, Jonah could take both dogs through the rear service gate at a scheduled time. Greta would wear a lead. Finn would either wear a light puppy harness or be carried if the snow was deep. One Hearthstone worker would remain responsible for them from departure until return. Earl looked down at Greta. "You are turning a visit into a military operation." "It is a walk with 2 leashes," Jonah said. "The paperwork only makes it sound less pleasant." The corner of Clara's mouth moved, though she did not quite smile. Earl did not laugh, but some of the resistance left his shoulders. The final condition concerned bad weather. Clara placed a blank emergency contact sheet beside the care agreement. Earl would choose the people listed on it. If he could not reach Roscoe because of ice, illness, or heavy snow, he had to call one of them rather than attempt the trip alone. Earl's jaw tightened again. Asking for help before he failed was harder than accepting help after everyone had already seen him struggling. Nora gave him a practical reason instead of an emotional one. "If you fall on that path," she said, "Roscoe loses the person who knows him best. Calling someone protects your responsibility. It does not erase it." Earl stared at the key on the table. For most of his life, strength had meant completing the task without making another person carry part of it. Age had changed the task, but his definition of strength had remained behind. Jonah thought of Samuel's letter. Perhaps God did not always answer a promise by making one person stronger. Sometimes the answer was a door, a list of names, or a dog placing her shoulder where an old man could lean. Clara drafted a 7-day trial agreement. During that week, Roscoe would remain in the storage building. Earl would retain the key and daily decision-making authority. The veterinary examination, food preparation, path clearing, equipment inspection, supervised dog visits, and emergency list would all be completed. At the end of 7 days, the group would review what had worked and what still placed Roscoe or Earl at risk. No permanent decision would be made that morning. Clara turned the document toward Earl. He read every line. When his hand shook too strongly to hold the paper flat, Greta rested her chin near his shoe. Earl placed his palm against the page until the movement eased. He signed. The signature was uneven but legible. Afterward, Earl reached for the key himself. No one had touched it. He returned it to the inside pocket of his coat. He did not thank Nora, Clara, Jonah, or the veterinarian. Gratitude would have required him to admit that the plan felt like relief. He was not ready for that. Nora walked to the window while Clara packed the documents. Beyond the glass, clouds had begun gathering over the northern ridge. The Weather Service had updated its forecast. A strong winter storm was expected to reach Frostwood Valley late Friday and continue into Saturday, the final day of the trial period. Snowfall alone was not the greatest concern. Wind could cover a cleared path in minutes, and temperatures were expected to fall sharply after dark, For 7 days, Earl would be asked to do something that had frightened him more than the winter road. He would have to remain responsible without insisting on being alone. The storm would arrive before anyone knew whether he could. The first change at Samuel Dorsey's storage building was so small that Earl Whitaker nearly refused it. Jonah Hale removed the loose wooden step beneath the doorway, cut a new board to the same width, and fastened it 2 inches lower. The adjustment gave Earl's weak right leg a safer place to land without changing the appearance of the entrance. Earl watched from inside with Roscoe beside his chair. "The old step worked for 30 years, Earl said. Jonah tightened the final screw. "It worked for Samuel's knees 30 years ago." Earl did not approve aloud. He tested the new step twice before Jonah left and said nothing about having to lift his foot less. That became the rhythm of the 7-day trial. People arrived, completed one specific task, and left without treating Earl like a project. Jonah inspected the wall heater, wiring, water bowl, and raised bedding. He replaced a cracked outlet cover and secured the heater cord where Roscoe could not catch a paw beneath it. Under the feeding area, Jonah placed a heavy rubber mat that would not slide when the old dog shifted his weight. Nora Bell divided Roscoe's food into smaller packages at Hearthstone. She left the labels blank except for the date. Earl wrote the feeding time and amount himself. His handwriting leaned unevenly across each label, but no one rewrote it for him. A young volunteer named Mason Reed cleared the snow path from the lane to the storage building. Mason had been the first person to accuse Earl at the fence, and the memory made him unusually quiet when he arrived with a shovel. He did not offer an apology he was not yet ready to explain. Instead, Mason asked how wide Earl wanted the path. "Wide enough for one stubborn man and one sensible dog," Earl answered. Mason measured a strip broad enough for Earl's cane and cleared it down to packed earth. He spread traction grit over the shaded sections and marked the edge with short wooden stakes so the path could still be found after fresh snow. Earl inspected the work from one end to the other. Mason waited for criticism. Earl pointed to a bend near the pines. "Widen that section. Wind fills it first." Mason returned to the shovel without argument. The exchange was not forgiveness. It was a beginning both men could tolerate. Dr. Miriam Cole arrived on the second afternoon with a medical bag and a folding mat. She examined Roscoe in the heated room, allowing the old dog to remain beside Earl rather than lifting him onto an unfamiliar table. Roscoe's heart sounded steady. His weight was slightly above the ideal range for aging joints. The stiffness in his hind legs came from moderate arthritis rather than a sudden injury. Dr. Cole adjusted his medication, recommended shorter portions, and demonstrated a safer way to support his hips when he stood. Roscoe did not need to be removed from the building. He did need regular monitoring and a plan that did not depend on Earl's body cooperating every day. Earl listened closely to every instruction. He asked about the timing of the medication, the effect of cold mornings, and whether Roscoe's slower appetite meant pain or simple fatigue. When Dr. Cole changed the dosage, Earl made her repeat the amount before writing it in a small notebook. Jonah noticed something important. Earl did not resist help because he lacked concern. He resisted because concern was the one part of his identity age had not taken, and he feared other people would mistake physical weakness for carelessness. Every new person entering the building made him more watchful. He checked the seals on Nora's food packages. He counted the medication tablets after Dr. Cole left. He tested the electric water bowl each morning and examined the heater switch whenever Jonah touched it. Jonah never told him to stop. Inspection was how Earl remained the person responsible for Roscoe, rather than the man standing nearby, while others made decisions. At the end of each afternoon, Jonah brought Greta and Finn through Hearthstone's rear service gate. Greta wore a sturdy lead. Finn wore a light puppy harness on the clearer days and rode inside Jonah's coat when the snow became too deep. The visits developed their own order. Greta entered first, smelled Roscoe's muzzle, moved along his shoulders, and checked the bedding. Only after confirming the old dog was where she expected did she lie beside him. Finn arrived carrying the blue-gray plastic bowl. There was never food inside it now. Jonah had washed it, but the edge remained scratched from being dragged under the fence. Finn still treated the bowl like necessary equipment. He carried it across the packed path, dropped it near Roscoe, then wandered off to investigate the heater guard or Earl's cane. On the return walk, Finn usually forgot the bowl until Greta stopped near the door and looked back. By the third day, Earl began leaving the bowl beside Roscoe's food mat. No one discussed what it had become. At first, it had been evidence of theft. Now it marked the route by which an old dog had remained connected to the rest of his family. The electric can opener sat unused for 2 days. Nora had chosen a simple model with a large push switch. Jonah demonstrated it once, then left the instructions beside the food shelf. Earl continued struggling with the manual opener whenever another person was present. On the third evening, Jonah arrived to find an empty can beneath the electric device. Earl had cleaned both the can and the blade, leaving no sign that he had needed the machine. Jonah said nothing. By the 5th day, the silence around it changed. Earl placed a fresh can into the holder, while Jonah adjusted the rubber mat. His fingers trembled too strongly to keep the rim level. The can slipped free twice. He tried a third time. Then Earl removed his hand and stared at the broad switch. "Move that guide a 1/4 inch to the left," he said. "The can keeps tilting." It was not phrased as a request for help. Jonah accepted it as one. He loosened the small bracket and shifted it left. Earl placed the can again and pressed the switch with the heel of his hand. The machine turned slowly around the rim until the lid released. Earl lifted the food into Roscoe's bowl. Neither man celebrated. Still, something had changed. Earl had allowed Jonah to correct the tool before failure forced the choice upon him. Later that evening, while Greta lay with Roscoe and Finn slept against Jonah's boot, Earl spoke about his wife. Her name had been Margaret. She had died 4 years earlier, after 49 years of marriage. In the first months afterward, people brought casseroles called every Sunday and asked Earl whether he was doing better. Each question carried an invisible deadline. They wanted grief to move in a direction they could recognize. Samuel never asked. He arrived with coffee, sat at Earl's kitchen table, and talked about broken fences, weather reports, or nothing at all. If Earl wanted to speak about Margaret, Samuel listened. If he did not, the silence remained ordinary. "He was the only man who came without checking whether I had improved," Earl said. After Samuel's death, Roscoe became the last living creature that still waited for Earl at a certain hour. The old dog knew the sound of his cane before the key entered the lock. Roscoe raised his head, as though Earl's arrival completed something. Jonah finally understood why the care agreement mattered so deeply. Keeping Roscoe fed was only half of the promise. The other half was that Roscoe gave Earl somewhere to be needed after the rest of his life had grown quiet. On the 7th day, the storm arrived 6 hours earlier than forecast. By noon, the northern ridge had disappeared behind blowing snow. Wind drove across Frostwood Valley in heavy white sheets, covering the cleared path almost as quickly as Mason had opened it. The plan was clear. Earl would remain at home. Jonah would feed Roscoe, check the heater, and stay until the worst of the weather passed. Earl's name remained beside each decision on the feeding sheet. The change concerned only who crossed the dangerous ground. Earl agreed when Nora called him that morning. Then the wind rose. From his kitchen window, Earl watched snow close over the road. He imagined the rescue losing power, animals needing to be moved, and Jonah being pulled in several directions. He told himself that one early trip would prevent anyone from having to choose between Roscoe and another emergency. He put on his faded military coat, took his cane, and left without calling. When Jonah reached the storage building in late afternoon, Earl was not there. Roscoe stood near the inner doorway instead of resting on the bedding. The old dog looked repeatedly toward the entrance, then toward the food shelf. Greta entered on lead and immediately noticed the missing rhythm. She smelled Earl's stool, the feeding mat, and a wool glove he had left the evening before. Then she moved to the outer doorway and raised her nose into the wind. Jonah did not release her. He clipped the lead more securely, lifted Finn inside his coat, and examined the snow beyond the steps. Several yards from the building, partly covered by drifting powder, were the round holes of a cane. Beside them ran a set of uneven boot prints. The tracks came from Earl's house. They stopped short of the building. Jonah radioed Nora, gave his route, and told her to contact Earl's home. Then he followed the prints with Greta, walking close at his left side. The wind erased the shallowest marks, but the cane had broken through the crust in a repeating line. Greta did not pull wildly or pretend to know more than the ground could tell her. She smelled the clearer impressions, moved forward, and stopped whenever the trail became uncertain. About 60 yards from the storage building, she turned toward a stand of trees. Earl sat against the base of a pine, one knee raised, and the cane lying across his lap. He was conscious and speaking clearly. His breathing was heavy, but he showed no sign of serious injury. His right leg had simply tired in the deep snow. Each attempt to stand had pushed his boot farther across the icy surface. Earl looked at Jonah, and then at Greta. "I was almost there." Jonah did not argue about the distance. He set Finn safely beneath the shelter of his coat, cleared the packed snow from around Earl's boots, and placed traction grit beneath the weaker foot. Then he crouched with one knee against the ground and offered his forearm. He did not lift Earl without warning. He did not take the key from his pocket. "Use the tree first," Jonah said. "Then use me." Earl pressed one hand against the trunk. The other closed around Jonah's forearm. He stood in stages. First his hips rose, then his stronger legs straightened. The right foot found the grit, and Earl regained his balance without being carried. Greta waited several feet ahead. She moved slowly toward the building and looked back after every few steps. Jonah kept one arm available while Earl walked. Finn remained warm against Jonah's chest, only his black nose visible above the coat. The return took time. No one treated the slow pace as failure. At the storage building, Roscoe was waiting at the door. Earl reached into his pocket. His hands shook so strongly that the key struck the lock twice before entering. Jonah stood close, but did not take it. On the third attempt, Earl turned the key himself. The door opened. Roscoe touched his silver muzzle to the head of Earl's cane. Earl called the dog's name, and the strain left Roscoe's body. They fed him together without naming it that way. Jonah set the can into the opener. Earl pressed the switch and measured the portion. Greta lay beside Roscoe while Finn placed the empty blue-gray bowl near the food mat. After Roscoe finished eating, Earl sat on the low stool for a long time. Snow struck the outer wall. The heater clicked on. Jonah waited without asking Earl to explain what everyone already understood. Earl had broken the plan because accepting help in theory had been easier than trusting it during the moment he felt most afraid. At last, Earl rested both hands on the curved handle of his cane. "Tomorrow, I will need someone to help with the cans," he said. "Not only the machine. Getting them set up before my hands are tired." He looked toward the storm-darkened doorway. "And the next time weather like this comes, I will call before I leave the house." The words were plain. They carried no apology and no request for praise. They were the first help Earl had asked for before losing the ability to choose. Jonah nodded once. Sometimes a second chance did not arrive as a grand forgiveness. Sometimes it sounded like an old man, naming what he needed, while the people around him had enough grace not to make him beg. The following morning, the storm had passed east, leaving Frostwood Valley beneath nearly a foot of new snow. Jonah was clearing the Hearthstone service gate when Clara Mercer called. She had found Megan Dorsey through a forwarding record and Samuel's former employer. Megan had answered from several states away. She had not known Roscoe was still on the property. She was already traveling toward Frostwood Valley. The 7-day trial had taught Earl how to let others help him keep Samuel's promise. Now the person with the strongest legal claim to Roscoe was coming home, unaware of everything that promise had required. Megan Dorsey reached Frostwood Valley during the 3rd week of December, while the road still carried gray ridges left by the storm. She parked beside Samuel Dorsey's empty farmhouse and remained inside the car long after the engine stopped. At 38, Megan had built a life around schedules, airports, and work that could always be moved to the next urgent thing. She was slender, with shoulder-length auburn hair and tired green-gray eyes. A dark canvas bag rested on the passenger seat beside her. Its faded luggage tag still carried the address where Clara Mercer's letters had been sent and returned. Megan had loved her grandfather. Love, however, had not prevented delay. Samuel had left several messages during his final weeks. Megan listened to the first few sentences of one, heard the weakness in his voice, and stopped the recording. She told herself she would call when she had enough time to speak properly. Then the next morning came. Then another flight. Then the message from Clara saying Samuel had died. Megan knew Greta and Finn had been transferred to Hearthstone Animal Refuge. She assumed Roscoe had gone with them. No one had told her an old dog was still waiting inside the heated storage building beyond the pines. Clara met Megan at the farmhouse and drove with her to the building. Jonah Hale was already there with Earl Whitaker. Greta and Finn had remained at Hearthstone for the first meeting, so the room would stay calm. Roscoe lay on his raised bedding when Megan entered. The old German shepherd lifted his silver muzzle. He studied her for several seconds, then smelled the hand she lowered toward him. His tail moved once against the mat. Megan knelt. The relief on her face arrived before the anger. "You kept him here?" The question was directed at Earl, who sat near the heater with one hand resting on his cane. Earl told her Samuel had signed a temporary care agreement. He explained the heated room, Roscoe's fear of unfamiliar kennels, and Clara's unsuccessful attempts to reach her. Megan looked around at the bedding, medication notebook, divided food packages, and electric water bowl. "You could have tried harder to find me." Earl's eyes narrowed. He said he had called the number Samuel gave him and mailed a letter to the old address. Both attempts had failed. Then he admitted the part that did not flatter him. "I could have pushed Clara harder," Earl said. "I did not." Megan stood slowly. Earl explained that he had feared she would arrive, attach a leash, and take Roscoe several states away before understanding what the move might do to him. The accusation struck close enough to Megan's intention that she could not dismiss it. "I am his family," she said. Earl looked toward Roscoe. "So were the people who stayed." Jonah saw the sentence land between them. Megan heard it as punishment. Earl offered it as proof. Neither interpretation helped Roscoe. Clara stepped in before the argument could harden. Legally, Megan had the strongest claim to make the long-term decision. That did not require everyone to pretend she already understood Roscoe's needs. Clara proposed that Megan remain at Samuel's farmhouse for 2 weeks before any permanent transfer. During that time, she would learn Roscoe's medication, feeding schedule, mobility limits, and daily habits. She would also need a realistic plan for the work trips that regularly took her away from home. Megan resisted the suggestion at first. She believed making her prove herself was another way of judging her for not returning sooner. Jonah did not defend Earl, and he did not excuse Megan. "Inheritance tells us who has the right to decide," he said. "It does not tell us whether the decision is ready." Megan turned toward him. Jonah added that failing to answer Samuel's messages did not make her incapable of changing. But guilt was not a care plan. Neither was Earl's fear. Roscoe needed someone who could do more than claim him. He needed someone willing to learn him. Megan agreed to the 2 weeks. The first days were harder than she expected. Roscoe ate only part of his breakfast when Megan prepared it. He accepted medication hidden in cheese, but looked toward the storage room door at the hour Earl usually arrived. When wind moved against the outer wall, Roscoe raised his head and listened for the measured rhythm of a cane. Megan mistook every glance toward the entrance as rejection. She moved too quickly when helping him stand. The first morning, she reached beneath his hips and nearly lifted his rear legs before Jonah stopped her. Roscoe needed support, not removal from the ground. Jonah showed her how to place a folded towel beneath the abdomen and let the old dog push with his own front legs. Megan practiced until she could support his weight without pulling him forward. She learned that cold mornings required Roscoe's medication earlier, before stiffness settled fully into his joints. She learned to place his food on the right side, because turning left too sharply made one rear foot slide. She cleared the path between the farmhouse and the yard, tested every rug, and removed a narrow table that forced Roscoe to turn in a cramped hallway. Earl visited each evening. At first, Megan treated the visits as examinations she had to pass. She watched his expression when she measured food and checked the notebook after he left to see whether he had corrected anything. Earl corrected almost everything. He adjusted the blanket. He moved the water bowl 2 inches. He reminded her that Roscoe disliked the metal spoon touching the ceramic dish. Each correction felt to Megan like another accusation that she had arrived too late. On the 4th afternoon, Jonah brought Greta and Finn through the service gate for a supervised visit. Greta entered the storage room and inspected Roscoe as she always did. She smelled his muzzle, ears, and shoulders, then remained standing rather than lying down. Megan had just prepared Roscoe's meal. She placed the dish near the bedding and called him in the same bright voice she used with unfamiliar dogs. Roscoe looked at the bowl, but did not move. Earl stood near the doorway, keeping his hands inside his coat pockets. Megan's frustration showed. "He ate for me yesterday." Earl could have corrected her tone. Instead, he remained silent. Greta walked toward the wall where Finn had left the scratched blue-gray bowl during the previous visit. She picked it up by the rim, carried it across the room, and placed it near Megan's boot. The act wasn't a judgment. The bowl belonged to a routine Greta understood. Food had once traveled inside it toward Roscoe. When Roscoe hesitated, Greta returned the familiar object to the feeding area. Finn followed and sat beside the bowl, one ear folded from tiredness. Megan stared down at it. Weeks earlier, people had called the bowl evidence of stealing. Yet Greta and Finn had carried food because they still recognized Roscoe as part of their old family. 2 dogs had crossed snow to perform the work Megan had not known needed doing. The realization did not excuse Earl's secrecy or erase Megan's absence. It changed the question she had been asking. She stopped asking who had the greater right to Roscoe. Instead, she asked Earl which side Roscoe preferred to sleep on. Earl removed one hand from his pocket. Megan asked what sounds frightened the old dog, how early medication should be given on cold mornings, and how Samuel used to call him from the yard. Earl answered the first question briefly, then the second. By the 4th, he had moved beside the feeding mat. He explained that Samuel never called Roscoe loudly. He used a low, drawn-out whistle followed by the dog's name. Megan tried it. Her whistle was uneven, but Roscoe lifted his head. She lowered her hand and repeated his name without forcing cheer into her voice. Roscoe stood with help from the towel sling, took several slow steps, and began eating. Greta lay down beside him. From then on, Megan's questions became more specific, and Earl's answers became less guarded. The 2 weeks developed a rhythm. Megan moved her work meetings online and told her employer she would remain in Frostwood Valley for several months while settling Samuel's estate. She arranged for a local pet care assistant on the days she had to leave town. Jonah agreed to serve as the emergency contact, and Clara placed the plan in writing. Roscoe began spending longer periods inside Samuel's farmhouse. The first afternoon, he paced between the kitchen and the front door. The second time, he slept for 20 minutes on an old wool blanket beside Samuel's chair. By the end of the first week, he stayed through dinner. Megan did not move him permanently in a single day. She carried over one familiar object at a time: the bedding, the brass-tagged water bowl, Samuel's worn blanket, and finally the low wooden platform. Earl continued visiting at the usual hour. Roscoe still greeted him with warmth. He touched his nose to the top of Earl's cane and followed him from room to room. But after 2 weeks, the old dog no longer waited at the door for hours. He ate normally at the farmhouse and slept through the evening when Earl went home. That was the proof Earl had resisted and needed. Roscoe could remember him without depending entirely upon his arrival. The official transfer took place on a clear morning after Christmas. Clara brought the documents to Samuel's farmhouse. Nora attended for Hearthstone, while Jonah arrived with Greta and Finn. Snow brightened the open yard. Roscoe stood beside Earl, wearing his reddish-brown collar and an ordinary leather leash. Earl held the loop in both hands. The tremor was visible. This time, he did not hide his fingers inside his coat. Megan stood several feet away. She did not reach for the leash until Earl was ready. He looked down at Roscoe, then toward Samuel's porch. For weeks, Earl had feared that releasing the leash would mean admitting he had failed. Now he understood that holding it forever would turn Samuel's promise into a wall around the very dog it was meant to protect. Earl extended his hands. Megan accepted the leash without pulling it from him. "God bless the friends who know when to stay," Earl said quietly. Roscoe followed Megan 3 steps toward the porch. Then the old dog stopped, turned, and walked back far enough to touch his nose to Earl's open hand. Earl rested his palm against the silver muzzle. Greta watched from beside Jonah. Finn sat in the snow with the empty blue-gray bowl held between his front paws, chewing lightly on its scratched rim. No one had won Roscoe. No one had surrendered him. A promise had simply reached the moment when keeping it meant placing it into another person's hands. That evening, Earl returned to his own house alone. He hung the faded military coat beside the door and placed the storage building key on the kitchen table. At the hour he once began his walk toward Roscoe, Earl remained in his chair. The room was warm. It was also very quiet. Roscoe had found a stable home. The promise was complete. For the first time since Samuel's death, Earl had no one waiting for the sound of his cane. For the first few evenings after Roscoe moved into Samuel Dorsey's farmhouse with Megan, Earl Whitaker continued putting on his coat at the same hour. His body remembered the promise before his mind accepted that it had been completed. At 5 o'clock, Earl wrapped Margaret's old brown-red scarf around his neck. He slipped the storage building key into the left pocket of his faded military coat and reached for the ashwood cane beside the door. Then he stopped. There was no food to carry, no medication to check, no old German shepherd waiting for the rhythm of his cane outside the heated room. Earl sometimes stood there for a full minute before removing the coat again. The key eventually found him a place on the kitchen table beside the military watch Samuel had left him. The 2 objects rested beneath the yellow light as proof that Earl had kept his word. They did nothing to answer the quiet. Wind touched the windows. The kitchen clock moved from 1 minute to the next. Earl prepared food for 1 person, left half of it untouched, and listened for a dog that no longer lived beyond the pines. Roscoe was safe. Megan sent updates almost every day. The old dog was eating, sleeping beside Samuel's worn chair, and taking short walks along the cleared path near the farmhouse. Earl was grateful. Gratitude and loneliness could occupy the same room. Jonah Hale recognized that before Earl said anything. At Hearthstone Animal Refuge, Greta began standing beside the rear service gate near the end of each afternoon. She did not scratch at the fence or try to escape. She simply waited with both ears raised toward the road leading past Earl's house. Finn developed his own version of the same habit. The puppy found the scratched blue-gray bowl wherever Jonah had placed it, gripped the rim between his teeth, and carried it in circles around Jonah's boots. By then, Finn was larger and steadier on his paws, though his right ear still folded sideways when he grew tired. The bowl no longer carried food. It carried a routine the dogs were not ready to forget. After 3 evenings of watching them wait, Jonah spoke with Nora Bell. Nora approved 2 supervised visits each week. Jonah would drive Greta and Finn rather than walk them across frozen ground. The visits would remain informal. No one would call them treatment for Earl's loneliness or suggest that he needed another dog immediately. Some absences were not repaired by replacing what had gone. They were softened when something living continued to return. The first visit took place on a clear Tuesday afternoon. Earl opened his front door before Jonah knocked. He looked from Greta to Finn and then toward the blue-gray bowl hanging from the puppy's mouth. "You brought enough fur to ruin every rug in the house," Earl said. The complaint would have sounded more convincing if 2 clean water bowls had not been waiting beside the kitchen stove. Greta entered slowly. She smelled the doorway, the legs of the kitchen table, and the old coat hanging near the wall. Then she approached Earl and pressed her muzzle briefly against his hand. Finn was less careful. The puppy dragged the plastic bowl across the floor, circled the table twice, and placed it on top of Earl's right boot. After inspecting the lower kitchen cabinets, Finn returned and fell asleep across both of Earl's shoes. Earl looked down at him. He made no attempt to move. Jonah sat at the kitchen table while Earl prepared coffee. They spoke about Roscoe's new medication, the weather, and a hinge Jonah planned to replace at Hearthstone. No one named the reason the room felt different with the 2 dogs inside it. There was no need. The visits continued. On some afternoons, Greta lay beside Earl's chair while he read the local paper. Finn stole 1 glove from Jonah and carried it beneath the kitchen table. On others, Earl sat on the porch with a blanket over his knees, while the dogs watched cars pass along the distant road. The quiet did not disappear. It changed from emptiness into companionship. During those same weeks, Clara Mercer completed the remaining estate documents. Megan formally declined to reclaim Greta and Finn. She understood that both dogs had already built a stable life at Hearthstone and a relationship with Jonah that did not need to be disturbed simply because she shared Samuel's name. Hearthstone finished Finn's vaccinations and health checks. Greta completed her final behavioral assessment. The report described her as protective, observant, responsive to calm handling, and strongly bonded to her puppy. Nothing in the record supported separating them. Jonah submitted the adoption application for both dogs. He did not speak of the decision as a reward for uncovering the truth. Greta and Finn were not prizes at the end of a difficult story. They were living animals who needed a permanent home suited to their relationship and energy. Jonah's timber house had a broad yard, a newly reinforced fence, and enough indoor space for 2 German shepherds. More importantly, it stood on a road that passed Earl's home and continued toward Samuel's farmhouse. The adoption became official in late January. On their first evening at Jonah's house, Finn investigated every room, carried the empty bowl into the hallway, and fell asleep halfway inside Greta's new bed. Greta walked the perimeter of the yard twice. Then she returned to the porch, sat beside Jonah, and looked down the road toward Earl's house. Jonah rested one hand against the side of her neck. "We know the way," he said. Greta did not understand the words. She understood the road. A week later, Nora asked the Hearthstone volunteers to gather inside the feed room. Earl attended with Jonah, but remained near the door, prepared to leave if the meeting turned into public sympathy. Nora did not offer him sympathy. She offered an apology. She told the volunteers that the rescue had observed several true things. Food had gone missing. Greta had blocked a hand reaching toward Finn. Earl had appeared near the rear fence and reacted angrily when questioned. Every detail had been real. The conclusion had still been wrong. We looked at separate pieces, Nora said, and arranged them into the story we expected to find. Mason Reed lowered his eyes. The young volunteer had already begun repairing his mistake through work, but Nora's words made the lesson belong to the whole rescue, rather than one embarrassed teenager. Nora returned Earl's visitor badge. Then she asked whether he would consider spending 2 afternoons each week in the quiet kennel wing. Earl immediately pointed out what he could not do. His hands were not steady enough for complicated leash clips. He could not lift food sacks, scrub kennels, or safely restrain a large, frightened dog. Nora said none of those tasks were being offered. Hearthstone sometimes received older dogs that had lost their owners, and dogs that withdrew into the back corners of kennels whenever people approached. Those animals did not need another person reaching through the door. They needed someone willing to sit without demanding progress. Earl looked at the badge in his hand. The first dog assigned to his company was an elderly mixed breed named Hazel. She had been surrendered after her owner entered long-term care. Hazel refused treats from volunteers and turned her face toward the wall whenever the kennel opened. Earl placed a chair outside the gate. He rested his cane against one knee, lowered his trembling hand where Hazel could see it, and began reading the weather report aloud. He did not call her repeatedly. He did not offer commands. On the 3rd afternoon, Hazel moved close enough to smell his fingers. Earl kept his hand still. The dog did not care that it trembled. She cared that it did not chase her. Jonah watched from the far end of the hall and understood that usefulness had never left Earl. It had only needed a different shape. By February, Hearthstone had begun working with Clara, Dr. Miriam Cole, and the Frostwood Public Library on a small community program for older adults living alone with pets. The idea came from practical failures everyone could now name. An owner might know every detail of a dog's care, yet have no one to call during a hospital stay. A bag of food might become too heavy before the owner was ready to admit it. An icy path or a difficult medicine bottle could place both a person and an animal at risk. The new program helped participants prepare emergency contact cards, feeding instructions, medication lists, transportation plans, and temporary foster arrangements. Volunteers cleared winter walkways and divided food into manageable portions. Each household chose someone to hold a spare key. Clara made sure every plan clearly identified who retained the right to make decisions for the animal. Help would not quietly become control. Nora suggested naming the program after Samuel and Earl. Earl refused. Samuel had not kept Roscoe safe to have his name painted on a wall, and Earl did not want strangers treating one frightened winter as evidence that he had become a saint. After some discussion, they placed a small wooden sign near the library meeting room. It read, "Help someone keep a promise." The first gathering drew 7 people. One woman brought instructions for an elderly cat requiring medication twice each day. A widower arrived with feeding notes for 2 beagles, and no emergency contact other than a neighbor whose telephone number had changed. Another man admitted he had postponed a medical appointment because no one could care for his parrot. The work was ordinary. Names were written down. Spare keys were assigned. Food containers were labeled. Phone calls were made before fear could become a crisis. Earl sat at the end of the table and showed one older man how to describe a dog's daily routine without apologizing for needing help. By the final week of February, sunlight had begun opening dark lines in the snow along Hearthstone's fences. Water ran beneath the eaves during the warmest part of the afternoon and froze again after sunset. Megan brought Roscoe to the rescue on a clear Saturday. The old German Shepherd traveled on a thick blanket in the back of her vehicle. At Hearthstone, Roscoe walked slowly beneath the covered porch and settled beside Earl's chair. He still touched his muzzle to the top of Earl's cane. He still raised his head when Earl spoke. Yet when Megan moved toward the yard, Roscoe watched her too. The old dog had not exchanged one bond for another. His world had simply grown large enough to hold both. Greta sat beside Jonah near the fence. Finn raced between the porch and the open yard, his legs longer now, and both ears nearly upright. The blue-gray bowl remained in his mouth. Finn carried it to Megan, turned toward Greta, and then ran to Earl. Halfway across the yard, the puppy dropped the bowl into a patch of wet snow. He picked it up, shook melting slush across Jonah's boots, and continued. When Finn reached Earl, he placed the bowl in the center of the yard and looked up. Earl leaned forward carefully. His hand trembled as he extended one finger toward the scratched rim. He touched it. Then he laughed. The sound carried across the yard, warm and unexpected. Jonah remembered the first morning of December. A puppy had been dragging food toward the fence. A German shepherd mother had blocked a young volunteer's hand. An angry old man had stood outside the rescue in a faded military coat. Every image had been true. Only the story people built from those images had been false. Greta and Finn had known nothing about temporary care agreements, estate law, legal ownership, or the dignity of aging. They had not been trying to expose a secret or teach anyone a moral lesson. They had known something simpler. Roscoe remained part of their old family. Earl continued trying to reach him, so the dogs had carried what they could. Jonah once believed that heroes were measured by how quickly they recognized danger and acted. Time had taught him otherwise. Sometimes the bravest person in a room was the one patient enough to question an easy conclusion. Sometimes courage meant admitting a judgment had been wrong, and sometimes mercy meant helping another person continue a responsibility instead of taking it away at the first sign of weakness. Earl had believed keeping Samuel's promise required him to carry every bag, open every can, and cross every winter path alone. Samuel's letter had tried to warn him. A promise did not become weaker when more hands supported it. The cleared path, the labeled food, the spare keys, Jonah's steady arm, Megan's care, and the small bowl Finn kept carrying had not reduced Earl's loyalty. They had allowed that loyalty to reach its proper end. Perhaps grace often worked that way, not by removing every burden, but by sending enough people to lift the part one person could no longer carry. The late afternoon sun crossed the wet yard. Roscoe slept beside Earl. Greta leaned against Jonah's leg. Megan stood beneath the porch with Nora, discussing the next veterinary appointment. Finn picked up the empty bowl again. This time, he carried it toward home. Sometimes the facts we see are real, but the story we build from them is wrong. A trembling hand does not mean a careless heart. Asking for help does not erase responsibility, and offering support does not have to mean taking control. Like Jonah learned, the better choice is often to pause, look deeper, and ask what someone needs before deciding what they can no longer do. Perhaps grace begins in moments that ordinary, when we listen before judging, hold a door instead of closing it, or help another person keep a promise they can no longer carry alone. Has someone ever helped you without taking away your dignity? Share your story or reflection in the comments. Subscribe for more grounded stories about loyalty, second chances, and the quiet choices that bring people together. May God give you patient eyes, a generous heart, and someone willing to stand beside you when the road becomes difficult.